Hey class, this is Professor Mitchell, and today we will be taking a deep dive into digestion and absorption. Digestion and absorption is a rather complicated process with a number of steps, so what we're going to do is break it down one by one into each individual process and look at how they're developed and how one leads to the next. And here we just have a general breakdown of the digestive pathway here. And the good way to think of this is almost as if it were a hollow tube running through us. So think of us as a donut with a hole in the middle. Our hole in the middle is more elongated than a donut in the sense that it would start at our mouth, go all the way down to our stomach, then down to our small intestine, around to our large intestine, finally to the rectum, where at that point we would be excreted whatever was inside, and we have a ton of organs along the way that are going to interface and involve themselves in that process. First, we're going to take a look at a quick video here that's going to explain a good overview of the digestive process.
Across the whole planet, humans eat on average between 1 and 2.7 kilograms of food a day. That's over 365 kilograms a year per person, and more than 28,800 kilograms over the course of a lifetime. And every last scrap makes its way through the digestive system. Comprised of 10 organs, covering 9 meters, and containing over 20 specialized cell types, this is one of the most diverse and complicated systems in the human body. Its parts continuously work in unison to fulfill a singular task, transforming the raw materials of your food into the nutrients and energy that keep you alive. Spanning the entire length of your torso, the digestive system has 4 main components. First, there's the gastrointestinal tract, a twisting channel that transports your food and has an internal surface area of between 30 and 40 square meters, enough to cover half a badminton court. Second, there's the pancreas, gallbladder, and liver, a trio of organs that break down food using an array of special juices. Third, the body's enzymes, hormones, nerves, and blood all work together to break down food, modulate the digestive process, and deliver its final products. Finally, there's the mesentery, a large stretch of tissue that supports and positions all your digestive organs in the abdomen, enabling them to do their jobs. The digestive process begins before food even hits your tongue. Anticipating a tasty morsel, glands in your mouth start to pump out saliva. We produce about 1.5 liters of this liquid each day. Once inside your mouth, chewing combines with the sloshing saliva to turn food into a moist lump called the bolus. Enzymes present in the saliva break down any starch. Then your food finds itself at the rim of a 25-centimeter long tube called the esophagus, down which it must plunge to reach the stomach. Nerves in the surrounding esophageal tissue sense the bolus's presence and trigger peristalsis, a series of defined muscular contractions. That propels the food into the stomach, where it's left at the mercy of the muscular stomach walls, which pound the bolus, breaking it into chunks. Hormones secreted by cells in the lining trigger the release of acids and enzyme-rich juices from the stomach wall that start to dissolve the food and break down its proteins. These hormones also alert the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder to produce digestive juices and transfer bile, a yellowish-green liquid that digests fat, in preparation for the next stage. After 3 hours inside the stomach, the once shapely bolus is now a frothy liquid called chyme, and it's ready to move into the small intestine. The liver sends bile to the gallbladder, which secretes it into the first portion of the small intestine, called the duodenum. Here, it dissolves the fats floating in the slurry of chyme so they can be easily digested by the pancreatic and intestinal juices that have leached onto the scene. These enzyme-rich juices break the fat molecules down into fatty acids and glycerol for easier absorption into the body. The enzymes also carry out the final deconstruction of proteins into amino acids and carbohydrates into glucose. This happens in the small intestine's lower regions, the jejunum and ileum, which are coated in millions of tiny projections called villi. These create a huge surface area to maximize molecule absorption and transference into the bloodstream. The blood takes them on the final leg of their journey to feed the body's organs and tissues. But it's not over quite yet. Leftover fiber, water, and dead cells sloughed off during digestion make it into the large intestine, also known as the colon. The body drains out most of the remaining fluid through the intestinal wall. What's left is a soft mass called stool. The colon squeezes this byproduct into a pouch called the rectum, where nerves sense it expanding and tell the body when it's time to expel the waste. The byproducts of digestion exit through the anus, and the food's long journey, typically lasting between 30 and 40 hours, is finally complete. TED-Ed is a nonprofit. If you value our work, please consider supporting it on patreon.com/TEDEd.
So we saw a number of concepts there, starting with the idea of digestion as a process, looking at how nutrients are absorbed, and even the idea of a bolus and how the bolus flows through and the pathway that it follows. So what we'll do is take a deeper dive into that and look at some of the finer processes involved with that. So as an overview, we saw that our GI tract is comprised of a long tube stretching from the mouth all the way down to the anus and involves a number of accessory glands like your salivary glands, which secrete enzymes for digestion, the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, and these serve a number of functions. We have ingestion and softening of food for the mouth. We have transport of ingested food throughout the entire pathway. We have secretion of digestive enzymes, acid, mucus, and bile, digestion of food, absorption of the end products of digestion, and finally elimination and excretion of waste. In terms of a broad overview, we see two different types of movement or digestion. We have physical movement, and that involves the chewing of food, and also peristalsis, which are the wave-like contractions or muscular contractions that push food along. We have segmentation, which are the muscular movement that occurs in the small intestine pushing food along. And this also helps to divide and mix chyme within the food. And then we have the chemical breakdown, which is more an enzymatic process where we see proteins that speed up chemical reactions, enzymes, and other secretions like hydrochloric acid, mucus, and bile help to break down what we've taken in. As an overview of absorption, we have three different processes that are involved in absorption. We have simple diffusion, which is just things that are able to cross the cell membrane. And imagine if we were looking at one giant cell, this is our cell membrane or that phospholipid bilayer, where things are just able to diffuse freely from one side to the other. We have facilitated diffusion, which involve a specific protein transporter, these guys. And then we have active transport, which requires energy as an input for the process to take something from a low concentration to a high concentration. So if we had a smaller amount outside of the cell and a larger amount inside the cell, we wouldn't be able to freely diffuse. We would require energy to take something from a low concentration gradient to a higher concentration gradient. We also have a few assisting organs, and we took a look at some of these in the video, where our salivary glands help to moisten food and supply salivary enzymes. Our liver helps to produce bile. The gallbladder helps to store and secrete bile. The pancreas secretes bicarbonate. And what we see is the pH balance of the stomach acid or hydrochloric acid is between 1 and 2. So that bicarbonate is going to help prevent us from digesting our own tissue within the small intestine. And then we have other secreted enzymes along the way. Here in the mouth, you can see we actually have a few different glands that produce enzymes within the mouth. And we have, most notably, down here, our sublingual salivary gland and our submandibular salivary gland. What these do is they help to provide salivary amylase, and these are going to act on the starches, and also lingual lipase, which acts on the fats within the mouth. And the majority of digestion in terms of the mouth is really going to be mechanical, where we're grinding things up, but we do have a small amount of enzymatic digestion as well. Just a fun fact, whenever we think of something going down the wrong pipe, what we're really looking at here is we have our digestive pathway, and then we have our air pathway, and between them, we have something called the epiglottis, and the epiglottis is a thin piece of tissue that helps to close off the airway whenever we don't necessarily want it open. So if you've ever had something that you've choked on, which I'm sure most of you have, what that is the epiglottis failing to close that pathway whenever a liquid or food enters, and that's how we end up getting it stuck in the airway. Next step, once we pass that point, we have the esophagus. And with the esophagus, we also have something called our lower esophageal sphincter, and that's going to separate the end of the esophagus from the beginning of the stomach. Once we get in the stomach past that lower esophageal sphincter, we notice that there's a large volume of hydrochloric acid along with other secretions that are going to help digest what we've taken in. This acid has a very low pH. We said about 1 to 2 a few slides back, and that helps prepare protein for digestion and also activates enzymes, one of which is the conversion of pepsinogen to pepsin, which is crucial for protein digestion because pepsin is a very active enzyme and is involved very rigorously in the digestion of protein. We also have gastric lipase, and we see some fat digestion occurring here within the stomach, and then intrinsic factor as well, which is an enzyme needed for B12 absorption. In terms of what's happening in the stomach, we have a few different actions. We have the churning and mixing of our food, also mixing up with secretions. We have the very acidic hydrochloric acid, which helps to unfold or denature these proteins. And you can kind of see that on this side, where we're taking a long coiled up protein and we're trying to uncoil it using the action of those enzymes and that hydrochloric acid. And then we see things like pepsin, after being converted from pepsinogen, breaking down that protein into smaller chains. Moving on from the stomach down to the duodenum or the duodenum, through our pyloric sphincter, which divides the stomach from the small intestine, what we see is we actually have 3 sections of our small intestine: our duodenum, our jejunum, and our ileum. Everything empties out into the duodenum or duodenum right here, and from there, it'll pass from one section to the next. What we see is the small intestine overall is a major site of digestion and also a major site of absorption, but that's something we'll cover later. And we do all of this across the mucosal membrane. The mucosal membrane is going to be that outer membrane of the inner tube. So think the very first group of cells that any food that we've eaten is going to touch within that small intestine. And what we notice is that mucosal membrane can actually secrete things as well as help to absorb things. And what we find in terms of secretions is bicarbonate is going to be secreted, and it helps to neutralize the pH of stomach acid. We also have bile that's going to be secreted from the liver. And in addition to that, we have pancreatic and intestinal enzymes, which come into play for carbohydrates, fat, and protein across the board. Then we have our enterohepatic circulation, and this is a recycling process where we see bile travels from the liver to the gallbladder, moves to the small intestine from the common bile duct, and these products, this bile helps to digest fat. And then what we do is we try to resorb that bile further down within the intestine and send back to the liver for reuse rather than having to produce more and more bile over and over again. Absorption in the small intestine occurs mainly because we have such a wide surface area, or an absorptive surface. We get this wide absorptive surface we saw in the video because we have a lot of folds, and the folds work where if we just had a flat line here, we would have one flat surface, just for sake of using our slide here, roughly a few inches. But if we went up and down each individual villi, our surface area gets exponentially larger, And then on top of each of these villi are microvilli, which again exponentially increase our surface area. And that's why we have such a wide area where we're able to absorb nutrients into. Past that, we have our fat-soluble vitamins, and these are really going to go to the lymph for the most part. And that's something we'll talk about even more as we go on. But the reason behind that is because our fat-soluble vitamins are going to get absorbed with the fat, and most of our fat's going to go to the lymph as opposed to going directly into the bloodstream like our other nutrients may be, because they have to be encapsulated within a micelle and a chylomicron and taken up through an alternative pathway. Our final journey that we see as nutrient digestion is completed once we get to the point where we're at the colon, preferably. I say preferably because some people do experience indigestion where nutrients are getting down to the colon and they're undigested. And usually at that point, it's causing some sort of digestive distress if it's a large volume of whatever is going undigested. What we also find in the colon is that some fiber is digested here by bacteria. So fiber, what we usually think of as non-digestible or something that we're not going to break down, isn't 100% truthful, because we do have some fibers, particularly water-soluble fibers, that can be digested. And often these produce butyrate. Butyrate's a very important bacteria fuel, I guess would be a better way to say, where the bacteria is producing this butyrate. It's a small fatty acid that's able to be used for fuel by the cells of our colon. This is also really important for a healthy and diverse gut microbiome, because our bacteria are able to use and secrete that chemical as well, or that fatty acid, excuse me. In terms of absorption in the colon, we have a large amount of water absorption occurring here, as well as some of our minerals, sodium, potassium, chloride. Vitamin K is also produced by the colon, so we're able to take some of that in, as well as B12. And that makes sense because B12 is one of our water solubles. Finally, at the end of this process, we'll see elimination from the colon. I really enjoy this slide. I think it breaks down very well what exactly is happening whenever we take in food. And specifically here, we're looking at a peanut butter and banana sandwich on whole wheat bread that just happens to have sesame seeds along the outer coating of that bread. And because of that, we have carbohydrate, fiber, protein, and fat. And each one of these little dots represents where digestion and absorption is occurring throughout this process. Starting in the mouth, we see carbohydrates digested using salivary amylase and also mechanical digestion. And that's going to help separate some of the starch from the bread and the peanut butter, where in turn the fiber covering the sesame seeds is crushed by the teeth. We see in terms of the fat, digestion's pretty minimal in the mouth. Some of our hard fats may melt, but outside of that, not a whole lot. And protein, we see foods are moistened and mixed with saliva. As we get down to the stomach, we see collecting and churning with some digestion occurring, where carbohydrate digestion ceases actually with the stomach acid, because the stomach acid is going to help inactivate salivary amylase. Our proteins from the bread, the seeds, and the peanut butter begin to uncoil or unwind when they mix with the gastric acid, and that's going to expose them to gastric protease enzymes that break down the proteins. A good example of that would be pepsin. And then we have our fat from the peanut butter and the seeds, which tends to separate from the watery GI juices. If you think of a salad dressing, our fat and our water tend to separate, and that's going to help the fats bind to bile later on. Once we hit the small intestine, this is where we're going to see a lot of action, specifically for carbohydrate, and that's noted here where you see the small intestine. We have more picking up and a large volume of carbohydrate digestion occurring, where we see enzymes within the small intestine enter via the pancreatic duct, and these help to break down a lot of the starches into smaller fragments, and these can be absorbed directly into the hepatic portal vein. Sugars from the banana are actually going to be a bit easier to digest. These are already broken down mostly into monosaccharides, disaccharides. Whenever we think of a banana, it's often sweet. That's because it has smaller sugar units that we can taste easier. So that's going to get absorbed directly as soon as it makes contact with the walls of the small intestine. And beyond that, we have our fat from the peanut butter and the seeds, which get emulsified by our bile. Now our pancreatic and intestinal lipases can begin to break those down into smaller fragments, and those fragments get absorbed by the cells of the small intestine into the lymph, not into our bloodstream directly, unless it's a certain type of fat. MCTs are one of those type of fats. That's something we'll touch on later. Then we have protein, which is going to break down, and that's going to depend on the pancreatic and intestinal proteases, which help to break those down into smaller fragments and absorb those through the cells directly into the bloodstream through that hepatic portal vein. And some vitamins and minerals will be absorbed at this stage as well in the small intestine. Once we get down to the large intestine, we see fluids and some more vitamin and mineral absorptions going to occur, as well as most of the fiber that's going to break down at this point will be broken down, and any that we're able to break down and produce that butyrate, that short chain fatty acid that's really good for our gut microbiome and our gut bacteria for fuel, will be produced. Next, we'll take a look at controlling movement, and whenever I say movement, I mean movement of the food or that bolus through the GI tract. We have two divisions here, our nervous system and our hormonal system, and we'll see how they work hand in hand for this process. In terms of the process itself, we see a lot of emerging research between the gut-brain connection, and this is something really interesting, specifically with psychological influence. Think back if you've ever been stressed and realized that it was giving you a GI issue. Well, for decades, researchers and doctors thought that anxiety and depression really contributed to these problems. But more research now is actually showing it might go both ways, where anxiety and depression may worsen symptoms for GI if you already have something going on, but may also cause them as well. So interesting to see how that'll develop and how we'll learn more about our gut and our brain being interconnected as one. What we also find is we have other influences, both chemical and bacterial. And something interesting in terms of our bacterial influences, if you've ever heard of C. diff or C. difficile, it's a bacterial overgrowth where we have a bacteria developing within the intestinal pathway that shouldn't be there in the volumes that it's found within. And one of our treatment methods is to take stool from a healthy donor and use their good bacteria, process it down into something, either a pill form or a liquid form that can be injected directly into the anus, and use the healthy bacteria from one person to change the bacterial colonization of the gut of another person. Take a minute to think about that. That's incredible. We're using bacteria from one person to change the bacterial species in another by injecting fecal matter from one person into the next. So this is something that's rarely done, and we only use that if we absolutely have to. But where we do see that again is patients with C. difficile or C. diff in the hospital. Next, we'll take a look at our cephalic phase. Our cephalic phase is the pre-eating, or the phase whenever we have some sort of stimulus that leads us to think about food, smell food, taste food. In some way, it's causing our body to initialize the phase of expecting food, whether see, smell, taste, hear, whatever the stimulus be. And what we get is this response where our salivary glands start producing saliva in response to the possibility of food being present. We see an increased heart rate and blood flow. We see the GI tract increase acid and digestive enzyme secretion and motility. We see the pancreas increasing digestive enzyme and secretions and hormones, and even the renal system firing up, where we're really just gearing up for a meal. Along this pathway, we also have a bunch of sphincters in action, and the sphincters are really just muscular contractions where we can pinch off one level or one area to prevent food from moving forward until it's ready or until we're ready. Think of it as a trap door. Something can go through, but it's not really meant to come back the way it came. A good example of this is our pyloric sphincter here that separates the stomach from the duodenum. Outside of the pyloric sphincter, we have our upper esophageal sphincter, our lower esophageal sphincter, our pyloric sphincter, our ileocecal valve, and then our two anal sphincters. And these make up all of the sphincters along the pathway. Beyond that, we have peristalsis and segmentation, and these help both to break up and mix food as well as move it through the GI tract, where our peristaltic contractions are pushing food along and segmentation is pushing back and forth, contracting to move and break up food as well as mix it with any gastric juices or digestive juices that may be within the bolus or the chyme at that point. Next, we'll take a look at nutrition and GI disorders that can frequently come up. And within that, we'll take a look at what are they and what would be our nutritional interventions for someone that may come into a hospital or clinic with that condition. Starting off, the big ones, the ones we see most often, happens all the time, both in and outside of the hospital. We see constipation and diarrhea. Constipation obviously would be a hard, dry, infrequent stool and a not full evacuation. And an easy nutrition intervention for patients that are constipated is just simply a high fiber diet, making sure you're getting more than enough fluid and exercising, because exercise actually does help increase gastric motility or move things along through the GI tract. In addition to that, we see soluble and insoluble fiber being beneficial. Whole grains would be a great, easy example of this. Diarrhea, on the other hand, are loose, watery, frequent stools. The opposite are going to give us the potential symptoms of a disease or infection, but can also be just a relatively frequent and normal problem that we run into for non-disease related issues. One of the problems that does come up often with diarrhea is that it can cause dehydration. You'll see this a lot in hospitals and nursing homes, and the easy nutrition intervention here is going to be number one, just simply rehydrate, make sure you're getting back what you lost, and then increasing soluble fiber to promote bulking of the stools. Remember, soluble fiber being soluble in water, so things like oats, peas, beans, apples, citrus fruits, and carrots all have that soluble fiber that just helps to bulk up the stool a little bit more and help resolve whatever is causing that diarrhea. Here we have the Bristol stool chart, and this is what you would see most often used if you were looking for a stool chart in the hospital to try to analyze what's going through the GI tract, where our normal is going to be a type 3 or type 4. Our next common GI issue is GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease, and roughly 20% of the adult population in the US has GERD today. It's particularly problematic for those who are overweight, and it's known as heartburn. Things to reduce if you happen to have someone with GERD, or you may have it yourself, would be things like alcohol, spice, lemon or citrus, mint, fried foods especially, coffee, and chocolate, because caffeine can also play a role with gastroesophageal reflux disease. The way it manifests here, and it's kind of hard to tell in the depiction, but we see these red streaks, and these red streaks are depicting inflammation and irritation of the esophagus, and that's what gives us that feeling whenever you get acid reflux of almost just irritation in the lower or the upper stomach area. Next, we see lactose intolerance, and this manifests because adults were not naturally intended to be able to digest milk, or at least one of the sugars in milk, lactose. And this was because we didn't genetically require the ability to digest lactose past the age of 2 or 3. So for the majority of time going through, we didn't have the enzymes continue to be produced in adulthood. And this is very evident in the Asian population, where we see that lactose intolerance is very common. In fact, the majority of the population has it because they just didn't continue to drink milk, or they didn't start to drink milk to a degree like we do in the West. It's very spectrum-based for lactose intolerance, and what I mean by that is you may have 2 people that are both lactose intolerant, but one may be extremely lactose intolerant, where another can tolerate 1, 2, 3 servings a day of lactose, but can't tolerate any more than a certain point. And what's easy and important is to just follow the symptoms and avoid any trigger foods that are problematic, and find a replacement if you do have that issue come up. Next, we have dyspepsia. Dyspepsia is a super frequent one. It's just indigestion. And this is not a disease itself, but it may be a sign of one. So common indigestion, pain in the upper stomach, chest region, feeling of overly fullness. And your nutrition intervention here is to just encourage a formal workup if it's persistent. Everyone gets indigestion once in a while, but if it's recurring over and over again or causing extreme discomfort, it's probably a good idea to get a full workup, at least with a normal routine physician, if not GI. Next up, we'll take a look at peptic ulcers or stomach ulcers. These are sores that develop on the inside lining of your stomach, and you can see a good depiction here of our gastric ulcer developing on the wall of the stomach. And you can also get these on the upper portion of your small intestine. Most common symptom is generalized stomach pain, and we have 2 different types here because we have some in the stomach, some in the small intestine, where we can categorize them as gastric or duodenal based on the location of them. Common causes of these, contrary to popular belief, are not stress and spicy food. They're really H. pylori overgrowth. That's a certain bacteria which can be particularly problematic to the GI tract in large quantities. And long-term use of aspirin or NSAIDs, think like Advil, Aleve, that kind of stuff. Although something that is important to note, your stress and spicy foods that we traditionally thought may cause peptic ulcers can make them worse and can cause symptoms to flare up. And that's probably where the link came from, where people assume that that's what was causing it just because they noticed it. If you do have a peptic ulcer, our nutrition intervention here would be to identify the root cause, whether that's the H. pylori. This is probably the most common, or your long-term NSAIDs may be equally as common of a trigger, and removing any foods that are causing issues or indigestion, just to expedite healing and make sure that process goes smoothly for you. Next up, we have diverticulosis. And what we see here, diverticulosis, is the presence of pouches or diverticula developing on the colon. And a flare-up or bleeding and inflammation of these pouches or diverticula is called diverticulitis. So an important distinction there, diverticulosis is the condition of having diverticula. Diverticulitis is where you see your pouches are getting inflamed, they're starting to bleed within the GI tract, and they're causing discomfort, particularly when eating. Nutrition intervention here is a high fiber diet to reduce the formation of our pouches that are particularly problematic. And during the periods of flare-up, avoiding any foods that cause particular distress. Next up, we have IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. In terms of the causes of our IBS, we see a number ranging from stress, anxiety, and depression to changes in the gut microbiome to even genetics. And symptoms manifest as common abdominal pain, constipation, diarrhea, gas, and bloating. And our treatment is just simply avoiding trigger foods, regular exercise to make sure we're increasing and maintaining our gut motility, or the movement and passage of food through the GI tract, as well as medication when necessary. Next, we see inflammatory bowel disease, and this is divided up into two subcategories. We have Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. These tend to be fairly similar, but the distinction between the two is going to be the location. So we see Crohn's is inflammation and irritation building up anywhere along the GI tract from the mouth to the anus, where ulcerative colitis, or UC, is particularly in the colon. And another distinction here is we see with Crohn's, it can be patchy or fill in, where we see a small patch in one portion of the colon, go down a foot or two, we see another patch. And ulcerative colitis, or UC, we really just see it continuously throughout. There aren't gaps between the inflammation patches. Bloody stools are common because so much of our GI tract is inflamed and irritated that it's easy to cut or draw blood from it. They're both considered autoimmune diseases with no cure, and on rare occasions, sometimes surgical intervention where an ostomy can even be required, where we're instead of using the colon that's so badly damaged, we create an artificial incision and remove waste through the incision into an ostomy pouch, which is going to collect all the stool and urine, everything that would have been in our GI tract that we're no longer able to pass safely. This is particularly difficult to treat, and infusions and medications are all part of treatment, as well as your nutrition intervention, which may include a low residue diet when necessary. Low residue diet would help to prevent residue, fiber, anything that's left over during digestion from getting to the colon, specifically when it's irritated, and treating any malnutrition that results, because if we're having the issue of an irritated colon, it's particularly hard to absorb nutrients from it. Next, we'll take a look at colorectal cancer. The key here is prevention, and that's very evident on the slide, but it's something that we just overlook. Our American Cancer Society recommends starting colonoscopies at 45 for adults in the US, and we have Cologuard, which is an easy test that you can do along the way. But all of this is to manage any polyps or small growths from becoming a cancer or developing past the point of a polyp. Nutrition intervention here, in terms of going about before you develop, increasing fiber, minimizing processed foods and red meats, minimizing alcohol, and controlling blood sugars and getting regular exercise. Contrary to that, during treatment, it's very individualized and often follows specific cancer recommendations, and will also depend on if the patient needs surgery or doesn't need surgery. Next, we have short bowel syndrome, and short bowel syndrome occurs with a removal of part of the GI tract. And this occurs after GI surgery when we intentionally take it out, usually for a number of medical conditions, things like irritable bowel disease, traumas that may have happened, anything congenital, cancer, or even a hernia. What we find, though, is we have difficulty absorbing fat-soluble vitamins, as well as other nutrients, specifically B12, because of the water absorption. And what we can do about that are either B12 injections or intralingual, where you take a tablet, you put it under your tongue and absorb directly into the bloodstream, as opposed to going through the GI tract. And another primary symptom or issue that comes up with this is diarrhea, as well as dehydration that pairs with that, and malnutrition. And this happens because, based on what part of the bowel was removed, we limit the absorption. Where we used to be able to absorb, now the rest of the remaining small intestine and large intestine has to try to make up for what was removed. What's really important is the site of the procedure matters, and we see anywhere from an ileocolonic anastomosis to a jejunocolonic, or even an enjejunostomy, where we're using our stoma here and secreting out into a pouch as opposed to down and out through the rectum. Next up, we have an ileus, and an ileus is a stoppage or decrease of intestinal function, and this often happens post-surgery with GI manipulation, especially if you have a surgery and you're taking opioids for it, and can lead to painful issues in the gut, vomiting, a number of GI symptoms. And something that I found particularly interesting is that a postoperative ileus, which is very common, increases our length of stay in the hospital and costs an estimated $1 billion a year, billion with a B. And it's the single greatest barrier to discharge after an uncomplicated GI surgery, where usually whatever pain medication, if it was an opioid given to reduce pain after surgery, is slowing down or stopping motility within the GI tract. What was super cool, though, is they found in a few different studies that chewing gum after surgery, sugar-free gum, just to make sure no nutrients are getting down into the GI tract while it's healing, can stimulate the gut and actually shorten our recovery time and our hospital stay, potentially saving up to $100 million just by chewing some gum. Of course, our nutrition intervention for this would be NPO or nothing taken by mouth, because if we have an obstruction within the bowel where we're not able to pass, we don't want to put any food or any liquid in there until we're able to safely make sure we can do that. Next up, we'll take a look at our stomach reduction surgeries, and these would be for weight loss, where we have our gastric bypass, also known as a Roux-en-Y versus a sleeve. Both of these are done, like we said, for weight loss, and the gastric sleeve, which is the most common now, removes a large portion of the stomach, and with that you lose any enzymes that you would have secreted from that portion of the stomach, but also the room for food, so we just fill up a bit quicker, still maintaining the same general shape and pathway of the GI system. Our Roux-en-Y, or our gastric bypass, does just as it sounds or implies, bypasses the stomach region, and we see our new stomach up here sends any food into a pouch, from the pouch directly into the small intestine, which actually used to be connected down here, so bypassing the duodenum and going straight to the jejunum, and that's going to prevent nutrient absorption, which in theory should prevent us from being able to take in as many calories, but in practice, we often see that patients are able to recover and start to absorb those calories again over time, but have a lot of issues regaining some of the nutrient absorption that would have occurred in the duodenum. Last but not least, we'll take a look at our gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is a huge emerging topic in the research, and what we've found is we have a gigantic totality of microorganisms ranging from bacteria to viri to protozoa, fungi, and collectively they have genetic material within us in addition to our genetic material that help make up part of us. They also help to digest nutrients within us, and within the body we have about 1 trillion cells. This makes up only about 1/10 of the number of protective microorganisms that live within you, namely within the gut. Within that, there are more than 500 bacterial species in the GI tract alone, and that's actually a good thing because the more populous and the more diverse, the better. And what we find is the benefits of a diverse, healthy gut microbiome may include anything from reduced GI disease and inflammation, regulation of appetite and satiety, weight maintenance, enhanced immune function, even control of our cholesterol and blood pressure. But one of the problems we run into is taking antibiotics, although often necessary for whatever is going on, wipe out our gut bacteria, because antibiotics aren't necessarily intended to kill 1 or 2 specific species. They're more of a catch-all, wipe out everything. And that's why we see antibiotic diarrhea occurring frequently. What's important to remember with our gut microbiome is that diet is the key driver, or one of the key drivers, that keeps our gut microbiome thriving or not thriving, depending on how diverse our diet is. It's important to get a good range of probiotics and prebiotics. And if you're wondering what are these, prebiotics are just the fiber in our diet. Probiotics are any live microorganisms that we take in. So think of in yogurt, we have certain bacteria. In foods like kimchi that are fermented, there are certain bacteria. To cap all this off, we'll take a look at one more video on the gut microbiome. And we'll go ahead and bounce over.
Trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi live on or inside of us, and maintaining a good, balanced relationship with them is to our advantage. Together, they form the gut microbiome, a rich ecosystem that performs a variety of functions in our bodies. The bacteria in our guts can break down food the body can't digest, produce important nutrients, regulate the immune system, and protect against harmful germs. We don't yet have the blueprint for exactly which good bacteria a robust gut needs, but we do know that it's important for a healthy microbiome to have a variety of bacterial species. Many factors affect our microbiomes, including our environment, medications like antibiotics, and even whether we were delivered by C-section or not. Diet, too, is emerging as one of the leading influences on the health of our guts. And while we can't control all these factors, we can manipulate the balance of our microbes by paying attention to what we eat. Dietary fiber from foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and whole grains is the best fuel for gut bacteria. When bacteria digest fiber, they produce short-chain fatty acids that nourish the gut barrier, improve immune function, and can help prevent inflammation, which reduces the risk of cancer. And the more fiber you ingest, the more fiber-digesting bacteria colonize your gut. In a recent study, scientists exchanged the regular high-fiber diets of a group of rural South Africans with the high-fat, meat-heavy diets of a group of African Americans. After just 2 weeks on the high-fat, low-fiber, Western-style diet, the rural African group showed increased inflammation of the colon as well as a decrease of butyrate. That's a short-chain fatty acid thought to lower risk of colon cancer. Meanwhile, the group that switched to a high-fiber, low-fat diet had the opposite result. So what goes wrong with our gut bacteria when we eat low-fiber processed foods? Lower fiber means less fuel for the gut bacteria, essentially starving them until they die off. This results in less diversity and hungry bacteria. In fact, some can even start to feed on the mucus lining. We also know that specific foods can affect gut bacteria. In one recent microbiome study, scientists found that fruits, vegetables, tea, coffee, red wine, and dark chocolate were correlated with increased bacterial diversity. These foods contain polyphenols, which are naturally occurring antioxidant compounds. On the other hand, foods high in dairy fat, like whole milk, and sugar-sweetened sodas were correlated with decreased diversity. How food is prepared also matters. Minimally processed, fresh foods generally have more fiber and provide better fuel. So lightly steamed, sautéed, or raw vegetables are typically more beneficial than fried dishes. There are also ways of preparing food that can actually introduce good bacteria, also known as probiotics, into your gut. Fermented foods are teeming with helpful probiotic bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Originally used as a way of preserving foods before the invention of refrigeration, fermentation remains a traditional practice all over the world. Foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, tempeh, and kombucha provide variety and vitality to our diets. Yogurt is another fermented food that can introduce helpful bacteria into our guts. That doesn't necessarily mean that all yogurt is good for us, though. Brands with too much sugar and not enough bacteria may not actually help. These are just general guidelines. More research is needed before we fully understand exactly how any of these foods interact with our microbiomes. We see positive correlations, but the insides of our guts are difficult places to make direct observations. For instance, we don't currently know whether these foods are directly responsible for the changes in diversity, or if something more complicated is happening. While we're only beginning to explore the vast wilderness inside our guts, we already have a glimpse of how crucial our microbiomes are for digestive health. The great news is, we have the power to fire up the bacteria in our bellies. Fill up on fibers, fresh and fermented foods, and you can trust your gut to keep you going strong.
So with that overview, we are going to finish up. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out via email, and I will go ahead and shut off the next video. Thanks, class. Have a good one.